Today's video is the third video in a three-part series. In the first one I talked about how to find pinch points. In the second one I talked about hunting in early mid-October, kind of during that lull period. And in this video I'm going to strictly talk about firearms hunting, or how do you hunt during the gun seasons. And there's a lot of different ways to definitely go about it, and it's going to vary region by region. There's a lot of very heavily rooted traditions surrounding gun hunting, so the stuff I'm going over in this video is not necessarily like the right way or the only way, but it's a way that I've found to have success in areas that are very heavily pressured public. You know, it's not unreasonable for places around me to have, 60, 80 vehicles on the opening day of gun season in one particular, overall chunk of public land. And so my strategy during the firearms season, unlike bow hunting, where if I'm looking for a place to bow hunt, I might look for places that might not get a lot of human pressure. But for gun hunting, my strategy really heavily relies on forced movement. It relies on other hunters to get the deer up and moving, especially considering a lot of times the firearm seasons happen after the rut in either really late November, sometimes even early December. So a couple commonalities between the various scenarios I'm going to go over. Number one, they're areas that are all very well known. They're definitely not secret by any means. They get a lot of hunting pressure already, so me showing them on the video isn't going to make any kind of a big impact. But they also all have opportunities or regions where deer can go and hide and get away from some of that pressure. And that's still allowing there to be an opportunity for plenty of deer to escape, plenty of deer to, find little tucked away spots where they can grow old. And so that's kind of what I'm focusing on here. I don't focus necessarily on some of the smaller chunks where there's just not a lot of overall cover for deer to go hide in. And just one other thing to mention, a lot of these scenarios are based on me just hunting by myself. So if I had another person or two, that might influence how we would tackle it as opposed to just hunting it individually. So just keep that in mind. This is based on kind of solo hunting strategies with forced movement from lots of other hunters. In this first scenario here, we got a very large chunk of public land, but you look at the habitat here and it is very heavily marsh. There's a lot of wetlands in here. You could have hundreds of hunters in a spot like this and still have plenty of places where deer can basically get away from everybody. I've gone ahead here on the map and basically just marked all of the likely access spots as well as some of the hunter trails that are most likely going to be traveled. Especially during the firearm seasons, 9 times out of 10, if there's a trail heading out from a parking lot, that's what guys are going to walk on. So I've got a couple spots marked here on either side of this road that runs right through the middle of this piece of public land. And if you look on this left side here, what we basically have is the region where you have most of this potential other hunter access up on this little bit higher elevation where it looks like you got some clear cuts. There's starting to be some tree growth that's coming back that I can tell in these areas. And then you also got some islands that are surrounded by more wetlands. And then if I go further south here, over a larger span of that open marsh, you got some more islands out here. And if I zoom into these islands, you can of course see the deer trails going from one location to another. They'll often kind of island bounce, meaning they'll go from one piece of high ground to another. When you're walking through marsh, you'll notice the same thing. It's like, I want to get to that spot, and you make a visual. It might be tall cattails around you, but you can lock onto something and be able to make it as a travel destination. And so I think that's probably how a lot of times these trails get established initially. And then you'll see basically just a lot of these islands acting as little hubs for travel. And deer won't always just travel island to island. I got a lot of footage and I've seen a lot of deer that will just be walking right out through the middle of an open marsh, and I just might see a rack just walking through with no trees, and where he's headed no trees. And I've kicked deer out of spots where it's just cattails. There's no trees for a good long distance, but oftentimes these little hubs like this can still be good. And so if I zoom back out again, if I'm looking at this region up here to the northeast and guys walking along these trails and pushing deer out from the edges of these hardwoods, the most likely areas that they're going to go to from that point could be this next level of high ground, which is out here on this string of islands. Same thing is true from this roadway right here. If guys are kicking deer out from the areas closer to the road, the next logical place for them to go is this high ground, one level removed from where they just came from. And so what I want to look for is there any one region in that spot that acts as kind of a hub more so than others? Well, if I look at where I got this tree stand located right here, this icon, a lot of this movement from up here could potentially come and push deer down to this location right here. And again, if I zoom in, I can see the trails running through here more so than anything up to either the west or the east of it. So this definitely seems like the most likely travel corridor to get to the string of islands coming from this region up to the northeast. And again, if I look down here to the east, you got just kind of this logical little line moving up here to the northwest. So looking at this, I would pick this particular island right here as kind of that hub that I would want to be able to set my stand up in. And the ideal scenario in a setup like this is you want to try and get in there really early as you legally can, and try to be set up before first light, so that when guys start coming into the woods with their flashlights and banging things around, they're going to start to get those deer moving, and those deer might be out in the marsh already before it even gets to first light. And then I'll scroll over here to the east side of this roadway, and I picked this spot particularly because if I zoom in here, there's a different type of tree. This looks to me like either tamaracks or cedars or spruces, some kind of evergreen tree grove out in this marsh. And there's been times on public land where I've sat right on the edge of like a cedar tamarack swamp and just counted like a dozen plus deer on opening morning for multiple years in a row, in times when you got 15 cars in the parking lot and all the guys are hunting the woods around it and you don't hear a single shot all morning. So these can be really productive. And what I find also is that, just like what I described a little bit earlier, a lot of times the deer will get pushed out into the marsh before first light, but by the time they get back to that next edge, that transition between the open marsh and some of those swamp trees, they'll start to slow back down again. They'll kind of meander around that transition line. So if I start from this roadway here, you can see there's definitely some islands here, and then at this last string of islands, if I zoom in again, you can see the trails in this marsh, and you can tell that there's a lot of them running north to south here. But where I picked this tree location, it looks like there's a good congregation of trails right kind of in this region here, sprouting from these two little small islands. So if you kind of keep in mind just that island hopping mentality from one to another, that corridor seems to make sense. And if I zoom in again, by the size of the shadow, you can get a good idea of how tall the trees are. Like for example, these trees right here, very small shadows, are not very big. Whereas you look at some of these trees up here, the shadows are bigger. These are going to be a little bit taller trees. So even though it might not look like it, you could probably get into a tree right around where I have this icon located and still be able to see and potentially shoot out a long ways over this open marsh. And I'll just draw a little line here so you can see 100 yards is this far. So if you draw a little 100-yard radius, that gets you all that potential visibility. And I also like the other side of this too. If I go over to this side of those swamp trees, I can see that there's another access over here to the east. And I turn off that public land layer temporarily just so you can see this a little bit more clearly. But if you've got pressure basically coming from this region down here, and you have deer that were either in those woods before first light when they got kicked out, or they were bedded right on the edge of there, and then guys, throughout the course of the morning go and walk around and bump those deer out of their beds and push them into that next layer of cover, you can basically look at this entire transition line here as places that would be the next logical place for deer to go. In this area, you got a lot of different little micro habitat features that are all kind of in that same region, right? We got what appears to be, oak islands. We got, those smaller swamp trees, bigger swamp trees, another couple islands, and just the difference in color here indicates to me that there's probably some of that real short marsh grass and maybe some regions with, either smaller brush or cattails or something like that. It's just like a mixture. There's a lot of different things going on in this area. And so if I can get back into an island like this, the one advantage you could have is, again, that could be used as a hub for movement. And a lot of times islands like that, by the time gun season rolls around, there's no foliage on the trees. So you can climb up and be able to get really good visibility in that type of an area. I'll scroll down to this area right here, and you can see on this one, all of your access here on the south side of this river is to the south. So you got this roadway running along the south side of the property, and that's where the majority of your hunting pressure is going to come from. And in this particular location, you'll notice that it's a lot smaller than the last place we looked at. You know, getting to some of those stand locations could take you a significant amount of time in that last example, and it's going to weed out a lot of hunters from trying to get to those more remote locations. But in a place like this, you got dry ground and the access is at the highest elevation. So there's really not a lot of things that are preventing people from literally walking a lot of that potential surface area in terms of that property. And that might mean that there's fewer of those more remote spots that are hard to get to that could congregate that deer movement. So in a place like this, one potential alternative to trying to find a spot like the last one is to hunt in pinch points. So I'll show a couple pinch points here that I know have been productive. I've hunted here before and I've seen and shot deer in some of these stand locations. If we zoom in to this area right here, you can tell that the bench on this particular hillside is about right here because it's really flat and then it drops off right at that level. And what you can also see here is there's some convergence of different types of trees, right? You got this appearance of trees right here, and this little swath is different from what's either to the left or to the right of it. And what this actually is this is a stand of pines that's probably, well, we can just measure it real quick here. It's about, 40 yards across, which is about right, having been back there. And then you got this open area of kind of CRP, more CRP out here, and then you got oaks to the northeast side of it. And what you basically get along the edge of those pines there is you get a nice little funnel that takes that movement from the south here. So any people that are coming into the woodlot here from the south and walking through these woods, they're kicking deer up. And there's also a waterfall right here. So again, some of that movement from the east here, you get deer crossing this ravine, and then they're trying to get, further out on this point. Those deer get funneled right through this region right here. And so by sitting up in one of those pine trees, you get good visibility of that entire funnel. And with a firearm, it's pretty easy to shoot, obviously, all the way to the edge of that bench and even in, pretty close to where that CRP is. It gets a little bit thick where those pines are. But it just gives you an example. I shot a buck there right at first light where a deer had probably gotten pushed from another hunter who was getting access into the woods, but it took that deer a while to finally get to that particular pinch point. I've also had, even hunting further back places like this, guys walk through at, 10, 11 a.m. You can't get away from everybody. But what that means is that if there's people walking around, they could, at any time during the day, kick deer up. And those deer could then run through those pinch points. So staying in a funnel like that all day is not necessarily the worst plan in the world. Another example right here, again, we have this waterfall right here. And if you got people walking in from the south, instead of deer coming and going to the northwest here, they could hook around and go to the northeast. You can tell there's a different type of cover right here. This is a really, thick, dense understory type of an area, and then it's a little bit more open right here. And so the deer will oftentimes travel right along that edge there above the waterfall, but just on the downhill side of where it gets really thick. And they'll just kind of hug around that corner on the top side of that edge to get around. And that's another place where I've had success. Sometimes in these hilly areas like this, if you have all the access is on top, but really not too much access from the bottom, then a lot of times where the deer will go once they do get pushed is they'll eventually make their way down to the bottom. And some of these bottom areas are especially avoided by hunters because if you go back down into them, you got to get back up. And if you shoot a deer down there, then you got to bring the deer back up out of the bottoms. So if there's no access points from the bottom, then a lot of times those deer could very well end up in those locations. So hunting in this type of a little hub area where you got a lot of different points that all drop down into this little drainage here is not a bad idea at all. Wind can be really finicky in areas like that, but remember you're hunting deer that have oftentimes been pushed into that location. They've been spooked by something else, and even if you do get busted by your wind down in locations like that, you're hunting with a firearm, so you might still have an opportunity to get a shot off. It's not like bow hunting where you'd be, game over. Here's another example like that where we have a piece of public land and all of the major access points are up high on this road. And you can even see if I zoom in here, you have access trails that go through some of these areas. And like I mentioned before, 9 times out of 10, if there's an access trail coming out of a parking lot, most guys are going to take it. So that already gives you an idea of where some of the hunting pressure might be kind of funneled into. So you could expect hunting pressure up on top of this ridge system. You could also expect more hunting pressure up on top of this ridge system. That to me right away is making this whole bottom region a potentially good spot to set up and get located in. Now, if you had access also down here, that would make that a little bit less desirable. Ideally, this whole south end is closed off from access, and you basically get all those deer eventually collecting into those lower areas out away from the access. The other thing to keep an eye on is that in areas like this where the access points are so close to where those deer could be bedding on those points, it's not going to take guys long at all to get set up before first light in some of these areas. And so a lot of times you might get deer that get kicked up and get pushed down into and through some of these funnel areas before you ever have an opportunity to shoot anything. That's another reason why I like bigger areas. The bigger the better in many cases. More hunters, more land, more places for deer to hide, and opportunity to get, one layer separated from where those deer will get pushed from, so that you have a better opportunity of getting some of that first light movement. There's been a number of times where I've been set up in what I thought was a good spot to be able to intercept deer movement from other hunters coming in, and just have a train of deer come through 30 minutes before first light and never see anything else for the rest of the morning, because that was the deer movement. And I missed out on it because I wasn't separated far enough from where those deer were getting pushed from. Depending on where you're hunting, in some of these really hilly areas, it's very common to see groups of guys doing deer drives, and maybe they've been doing it in a particular location for 20, 30 years or something like that, where they'll just have a couple of standers get down to one of these hub type areas in the bottom, and they'll have all their buddies just go up on each individual one of those points, and they'll all just start pushing down those points and kicking all those deer down into those bottom areas. Some of those types of drives, it's amazing anything slips through. But they can be really effective for people that are doing that kind of a strategy. Of course, when you're hunting by yourself, you obviously can't do that, but for some of that movement, you can expect the same type of thing, where if you're hunting in a bottom area and you get any random guy walking along the top end of the ridge, he could kick deer down off of their beds and into that bottom area where they're seeking cover. Sometimes in those bottom areas you might have just a wide open understory. Sometimes you might have an area that's choked down with buckthorn, it's really thick, and that can all impact how likely those deer are to drop down in those bottom areas too, and how likely they are to slip through the cracks, and how likely it is you're going to be able to get a shot or not. And so what about big woods type areas? Well, usually there's going to be some kind of combination of either hills or swamps or something like that. Very rarely do you have a true big woods area that's just flat and monotonous. And if you do have a place like that, it's not likely a place that I would want to focus in on anyway. I like edge. I like having places where deer can have good cover that they can go into. I like it when that cover is very secluded, allows deer to get away and grow old, and has a lot of hunting pressure during the gun seasons to be able to get that forest deer movement. So in big woods areas, you don't get probably as many hunters per square mile as you do in some of those smaller chunks of public land. So that is going to make your forest movement a little bit less than what you might expect on some of those smaller chunks. However, what I've noticed in the times that I have hunted in some of those big woods areas, you get the logging roads and the county roads and things like that, where a large majority of the guys that do hunt there are probably hunting within a couple 100 yards of some of those logging roads. They'll basically just walk down, they'll hit a scrape or some kind of deer sign, and they'll just kind of meander off on that trail for 100 yards and just kind of sit on a knob and overlook an area that they can see 100 yards or so. So here's an example. This area is in Wisconsin. It's just got a lot of rolling hills mixed with marshes and swamps and clear cuts that were logged out. And so what you got here is you got a little logging road system that I have in this yellow dotted lines. You got one on the east side, one on the west side of this marshy area. And you can assume that during the gun season, when you got a large influx of hunters, more so than any other time of the year, you can scout a place like this and probably find some tree stands and like salt blocks and trail cameras like that from guys that are bow hunting it. But during the firearm season, you'll get a lot more guys. And a lot of those guys, again, they're just going to be walking along these logging roads until they've cut some kind of deer sign, and then they'll just go off into the woods, a few 100 yards maybe, and just pick an area to kind of observe. And so in an area like this, what I would try and do is, again, find an area that's as close as you can to some of the best cover that's furthest away from anybody who's going to be coming from the most common access. And so if I look at this particular area, people that are walking along this trail and want to cut toward the swamp, there's a good likelihood that they could bump out any of these deer that were bedded along this transition. And so if I were to go and sit in a spot like this, there's a good likelihood that as deer get kicked through that cover, they might filter through this area before they jump out into this open marsh area and maybe cut through to the other side. Same kind of thing down here. You have this, it's almost like a little island of trees here that's separated from this area that looks like it's probably a lot higher stem count. And so if deer get busted through this area, there's a decent chance they might go through this area where it's this last little point of high ground, again, before exiting out to open marsh. And this also represents the shortest distance in this particular area between high ground and high ground across this marsh. Another advantage of hunting on a point like that is you get elevated up enough and you can even start to see down into a lot of this area, and you can be able to see deer out a good ways. Right, here's your 200 yard. You can use rifles in Wisconsin, for example. So I mean, here's your 200 yard radius, and that can be a pretty good option. So I hope you guys found this video to be helpful. Hope you guys found the series to be helpful. I didn't go through as many different types of scenarios for this gun hunting as I did, say, for pinch points, for example, but I also feel like, for me at least, when I'm hunting by myself, I only look for those certain characteristics. I try to find areas that have as much force movement as possible, but also have a really good amount of cover, and areas where I can get into locations that cover is separated from where most of the hunters are going to be accessing from, so that I have a better likelihood of actually seeing daylight movement. And just by trying to meet those criteria, by default weeds out a lot of different types of places and scenarios. So if you guys have any other questions or comments, please drop them in the comments section down below, and thanks for watching.